don't know the world you're living in.
Welcome to the future.
Welcome to today's show. I am the gadfly sent by God to rouse you from your slumber into an examined life. And recently, I've been thinking a lot about the ethics of societal collapse or social unrest, and how many people in the survivalist or prepper community often talk about how the ethical landscape would be different. The basic argument goes that without law and without society's check and balance on the individual, most people would devolve into opportunistic, self-serving criminals. A similar argument was echoed when Socrates discussed the idea of the ring of Gyges, whose wearer would become invisible upon wearing it, to which his opponent suggested that all men would do something at least a little bit unethical if they could wear such a ring. In the prepper community, at the very least, the notion of altruism is expected to totally disappear. I don't disagree that this would happen, but what interests me is twofold. First, should this happen? Is our situation today any different than a post-apocalyptic scenario? And second, if we suggest that this should happen, then does this imply that moral consideration ought to come second to one's own well-being? And if so, how far do we push that? I'm going to examine these questions and more in this episode, so let's get into it. To address the first question of whether human beings ought to forego ethical codes of conduct when the proverbial shit has hit the fan, we have to first consider what that actually means. A large-scale global or national crisis is easy to point out. An EMP shuts down the power grid and no electronics or technology are able to be used, for example. Or a nuclear holocaust kills off tens of millions of people. These are easy situations to put your finger on and say, this is a crisis. But absent these large, definitive, seminal events, the human being, biologically speaking, experiences several more localized and personal crises every single day. Simply maintaining homeostasis requires a person to eat adequate quantities of calories, but not eating makes a person hungry, which is simply the body's way of saying, we are headed toward destruction if you don't put some calories in us. Make no mistake, death by starvation and death by bomb explosion are equally detrimental to the human body. And to be quite honest, more people die of starvation than have ever died by any nuclear explosion. Yet, despite this, we don't consider ourselves in a crisis each day. Every day we could starve to death, dehydrate ourselves to death, get an infection from a minor cut and die, get struck by an automobile, or simply die from our pet attacking us. Effectively, what I'm trying to say is that our current bodies are no less in a crisis than those in a post-apocalyptic world. Modern technology and consumer comforts simply mask the threats we face each day, and one of those large-scale calamitous events is simply a forceful removal of that mask, rather than a total change of situation. In short, the big, monumental events shine a spotlight on those minor crises we face every day. After all, the problem with a bombing attack or grid-down event is not so much the initial blast, but rather the problems that come from it, like acquiring food, water, and shelter resources. The same issues our species has had since its beginning. These events don't put us into a new way of living. They put us into the old way of living, a way which our biology has never escaped, but rather masked. When we consider ethics from this masked reality that we live in, it seems to suggest that our ethics is designed not to be natural and rooted in the human condition, but to help us navigate our plastic world without much issue. Many philosophers of the past have suggested that ethics is something that merely keeps society in order, yet has no objective basis in reality. And this position is not uncommon today. But without spending too much time discussing whether moral facts exist independently of individual perspective or social agreement, the fact still remains that crisis is ever upon us. The question then becomes, why are some crises considered valid grounds for abandoning moral action? Whether one thinks morality is a mere contract between individuals within a society, or something objectively derived from a law of nature, the problem still presents itself. Again, I fully understand the practical reasons why one might not want to extend an olive branch to any and everybody after a large-scale crisis event. It gives a very poor chance of survivability. But the question is not, will this abandonment of ethics happen, but should it happen? The law of the excluded middle would suggest that there are two options to answer this question: yes and no. If we say no, this shouldn't happen, and we ought to maintain our standards of morality, then how far do we push that? If a person can kill a tyrant, for example, but knows he will die in the process, is he morally obligated to do so? Or how about the famous fat man trolley problem thought experiment? Basically, there are several people tied to a track, and a train is coming. They're standing next to a man who is so fat that if the train would hit him, it would be forced to stop, and thus be unable to kill the several other people on the track. If our moral rules say not to murder, then how do we solve this problem? Essentially, saying that we ought to maintain our standards of morality, despite the danger posed to us, faces all the same problems as strict deontology. Do you lie to murderers who come to your door looking for potential victims you might be hiding? If Pedro takes 20 hostages and says, if you kill one, he'll let the other 19 go, but if you refuse, he'll kill all 20, do you pull the trigger? Does justice demand returning an axe to a man who is an axe murderer? After all, it is his possession, and etc. So what if we say yes, we ought to abandon morality when it endangers us? Do what you can, but if it's too dangerous, forget about it. If that is the case, then I think we have to consider that in our day-to-day, non-nuclear winter lives as well. Because, as I've stated prior, the only difference between our lives today and our lives after a monumental event is really the size of the event. If we face crisis each and every day, and we're talking about a much more amplified crisis, then we're really only talking about a much more amplified course of ethical action. Obvious examples come to mind to undermine this answer too, such as a drowning child. If I'm endangered by jumping into water to save a drowning child, should I accept that risk and save the child? Also, what becomes of moral virtue of courage, if any frightening or dangerous situation can remove us from our ethical obligations? In fact, wouldn't such an abandonment of our codes of conduct be less likely to ensure the survivability of our civilization? After all, if nobody stands to defend anybody else, and we have no person in society willing to face danger, then even the smallest danger becomes an existential threat. One possible solution is that we ought to consider our risk in proportion to the relation we share to the person in question. For example, many parents say that they would do anything, regardless of the consequences, to save the life of their child. And if you extend that, you can get a nice continuum in which you are willing to sacrifice a great deal for your child, a little bit less for a nephew, a little bit less still for a cousin, even less for a neighbor, and very little for a complete stranger. Of course, that raises a problem too, because nobody's closer to us than our own self, and we fall back into the situation of being willing to sacrifice anybody to save ourselves. Perhaps we need additional variables. In addition to the relationship we share with the person in question, we might also consider whether our action will actually do any good. It makes no sense to attempt a tracheotomy if you have no medical experience. You'll probably just make the situation worse. That still leaves issues regarding more nuanced cases, like if your brother is in a dangerous situation which is life-threatening, but your child is in a dangerous situation which might not cost him his life but could seriously injure him, and assuming you have the means to help both, intuition suggests that we should save our brother first, but we still desire to help both. So perhaps an additional third variable could consider the amount of harm as a factor. But perhaps we can throw out all of these considerations, and instead consider ourselves. After all, doing something good generally means to bring about benefits through our actions. And action can be safely divided into two categories: those we control and those we don't. If we consider a game of tennis, for example, we cannot control the outcome. We cannot control the skill of our opponent. We cannot control even how our own body functions that day. What we can control is how we mentally approach the situation. We can also control our desire to do our best. Likewise, we can control our resolve to attempt, as much as our body will physically let us, to do something effective. Therefore, we can always resolve to do the most good, and when we are faced with issues that are out of our control, we choose the most good, not from an objective ideal, but rather from within that situation. If we reconsider the fat man in the trolley again, we see that our options are limited to choosing to push or choosing not to. Both are terrible options, but there is no third option of not pushing, yet still having the people tied to the track remain safe. That option is not in our control, and it is not an option we have. It would do us good to simply forget that possibility altogether, because it only clouds our judgment and makes us less effective. Once we understand which actions we can choose and which we cannot, we ought to then choose to prevent, reduce, or eliminate the most amount of suffering. For a more detailed explanation of why I think that is, check out episode 4, in which we talk about negative utilitarianism. This we can apply to our lives today by simply developing an awareness that some actions are in our control and some are not, and develop a good habit of acting upon those actions which are in our control. Once we have that habit developed, we can develop the additional habit of reducing suffering. And of course, that will begin with those closest to us. We help our family when they're troubled. We help our friends when they're in need. And we can begin to extend that out as far as we can, while still understanding that we can help the people closest to us most effectively. And we have more control over what we do to the people around us than to strangers. We can then put these 3 variables together as such. 1. Discerning between what we can control and what we cannot, which allows us to make a clear-headed decision on what to do. 2. Remembering our responsibility to those with whom we have shared the most intimate moments of our lives, and extending that boundary out from our closest loved ones to the most foreign of strangers. And 3. Prioritizing eliminating suffering over adding frivolous pleasure. Together, these give us a very common sense code of ethics, which has us helping our loved ones, caring for the sick, the needy, the suffering, and doing so in a way that we can actually achieve, rather than sticking to high-minded ideals which we cannot put into practice and might actually get us killed. If you stuck through to the end, I appreciate it. I know this one is a bit longer than my usual installments, but I think we accomplished a lot of good things here. I simply ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this. As always, I'm very curious to see what you have to say about these ideas, so discuss them in the comments section. Until next week.
They want men to see either that or everyone else's.